The corridor was silent except for the echo of polished boots on marble. Officer James Whitmore had stood guard at Buckingham Palace for 11 years, but he had never seen the Queen Consort's face look quite like that. It was April 2023, just weeks after the coronation, and something was about to break the careful calm of the palace walls. The morning had started like any other. James took his position outside the East Gallery at 6 sharp, shoulders back, eyes forward. But by 9 o'clock, whispers were already moving through the staff corridors like smoke under a door. The Queen Victoria tribute, the unveiling, and Camilla's reaction to what had been placed inside the frame. If you want to hear stories like this that pull back the curtain on royal life, hit that subscribe button now. You won't want to miss what happens next. James didn't know the full story yet. None of the guards did. But he could feel the tension building in the air the way you feel pressure before a storm. The senior staff moved differently that morning. Their faces were tight. Their voices, when they spoke at all, were carefully neutral. It was Margaret, one of the longest-serving housekeepers, who first gave him a clue. She passed him in the corridor carrying fresh linens, her eyes red-rimmed. When she thought no one was looking, she touched the small pendant at her throat. A gift, James knew, that the late Queen Elizabeth had given her 20 years ago after. Margaret's son had died. Something about the Queen. Something about a promise. The doors to the east gallery had been closed since dawn. That alone was unusual. The gallery was typically open for staff to pass through, a shortcut between the private chambers and the staterooms. But today, palace security had been posted at both entrances. No one in, no one out. Not until the lady of the household gave clearance. James heard the click of heels on marble before he saw her. Lady Catherine Ashford, severe and silver-haired, moved down the corridor with the kind of authority that came from 4 decades of palace service. She didn't acknowledge James, but she didn't need to. Her face said everything. Worry, disapproval, and something else. Defiance. She pushed through the gallery. Doors, and they swung shut behind her with a heavy thud. From inside, James heard voices. Not loud, not shouting, but sharp-clipped, the kind of quiet argument that cuts deeper than any scream. He recognized Camilla's voice immediately, measured and controlled, but with an edge he'd never heard before. And then Lady Catherine's response, calm but unyielding. The words were muffled, but one phrase came through, clear as glass. The late Queen made her wishes very clear. James felt his pulse quicken. In all his years of service he had learned one golden rule. The palace was built on secrets, and a good guard never repeated what he heard. But this felt different. This felt like history unfolding in real time. The door opened again. Lady Catherine emerged, her face composed, but her hands trembling just slightly as she smoothed her jacket. She caught James's eye for just a fraction of a second. In that glance, he saw something that chilled him. Fear. Not for herself. For what was coming, she walked away without a word. Inside the gallery, silence fell again. But it wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of silence that comes right before something breaks. James kept his eyes forward, his breathing steady, his face blank. But his mind raced. What had the late Queen requested? What tribute could cause this kind of fracture in the carefully polished world of the palace? And why did it feel like everyone who had loved Queen Elizabeth was quietly choosing sides? The answer was behind those doors. And soon, the entire palace would know. Asterisk, asterisk, the morning stretched into afternoon, and still the gallery remained closed. James had been relieved for lunch and returned to find 2 additional guards posted near the entrance. Security was tightening. Whatever was happening inside those walls, the palace wanted it contained. It was Thomas, a fellow guardsman and James's closest friend in the service, who finally told him what the staff had been whispering about since dawn. They stood in the lower corridor during shift change, voices low, eyes watching for anyone who might overhear. "It's a portrait," Thomas said quietly. Queen Elizabeth commissioned it 6 months before she died. A tribute to Queen Victoria, her great-great-grandmother. But it wasn't just about Victoria. James waited. Thomas glanced down the hallway, then continued. The Queen had specific instructions written into her final requests. The portrait was to be unveiled on the anniversary of Victoria's death, February 6th. But there was a delay. Palace politics. They only just finished the installation last week, and when Camilla saw what was actually in the painting, she demanded it be removed. James felt something cold settle in his stomach. Why? Thomas's jaw tightened. Because Queen Elizabeth had herself painted into it. Standing beside Victoria, both of them in full regalia, two queens separated by more than a century, but united in duty. And at the bottom of the frame, there's an inscription. A quote from Victoria's diaries about the weight of the crown and the responsibility it carries. But here's the part that matters. He paused, making sure no one was approaching. The inscription ends with a line Queen Elizabeth added herself. May those who come after us remember that service is not a title. It is a calling. The words hung in the air between them. James understood immediately. This wasn't just a tribute to Victoria. This was a message. A reminder. And depending on how you read it, it could be seen as a challenge to anyone who hadn't been born into the role. Camilla thinks it's a slight, Thomas continued. Some of the staff agree. They say it's meant to draw a line between those born to the throne and those who married into it. That the late Queen was making a point about legitimacy, and the others. The others say Queen Elizabeth was simply honoring tradition and reminding everyone, including herself, what the crown really means. They say Camilla is reading insult where none was intended. James looked toward the closed gallery doors. What does Lady Catherine think? Thomas smiled grimly. Lady Catherine was there when the Queen gave the instructions for the portrait. She says the Queen's intentions were clear and that the painting stays exactly where it is. She's refusing to have it moved. That explained the tension. Lady Catherine had served Queen Elizabeth for nearly 40 years. Her loyalty wasn't just professional. It was personal, bone deep. And now, she was standing between Camilla and a direct order. This was more than palace politics. This was about legacy, about memory, about who had the right to shape how Queen Elizabeth would be remembered. The rest of the afternoon passed in strange stillness. Staff moved through the palace like ghosts, speaking in hushed tones, avoiding eye contact. Everyone knew something was wrong, but no one wanted to be the one caught talking about it. James returned to his post outside the gallery at 4 o'clock. The doors remained shut, but now there were voices again. More people inside. He recognized the private secretary's voice, calm and diplomatic, trying to mediate, trying to find middle ground where none existed. Then Camilla spoke, and this time her voice was different. Still controlled, still measured, but underneath there was something sharp and final. I will not have my position undermined by a painting. I don't care what the late Queen intended. This is my palace now. That portrait will be moved to a private room, or it will be placed in storage. Those are the only two options. Silence. Then Lady Catherine's voice, quiet but unmistakable. With all respect, Your Majesty, you're wrong. This palace has never belonged to any one person. It belongs to the crown, and Queen Elizabeth's final wishes regarding the tribute will be honored. The portrait remains. James heard a sharp intake of breath from inside the room. Someone, probably the private secretary, tried to interject, but Camilla cut them off. We'll see about that. The doors opened suddenly. Camilla emerged, her face a mask of composure, but her eyes blazed with something James had never seen before. Quiet fury, the kind that doesn't shout, the kind that plans. She walked past him without a glance, her steps precise and deliberate. Every inch the Queen consort, but behind her, still standing in the gallery, Lady Catherine remained in front of the portrait. Her hands were folded. Her chin was high, and on her face was an expression James would never forget. Absolute resolve. The battle lines had been drawn. Asterisk by evening. The news had spread through every corner of the palace. Not through official channels. Never that. But through the invisible network of staff who had worked these halls for decades, who had loved the late Queen, and who now watched carefully to see what would become of her. Legacy. James finished his shift at 8 and headed toward the staff quarters. But he found himself walking past the gallery one more time. The doors were open now. Inside, the portrait hung on the far wall, illuminated by soft gallery lights. He stepped inside just for a moment. The painting was breathtaking. Queen Victoria sat in the foreground, regal and stern, exactly as history remembered her. But behind her, painted with extraordinary detail, stood Queen Elizabeth. Older, wiser, her expression gentle but unwavering. Two women, separated by time, united by the weight they had carried, and there, at the bottom of the ornate frame, the inscription gleamed in gold lettering. May those who come after us remember that service is not a title. It is a calling. James understood now why this mattered so much, why Lady Catherine was willing to risk her position, why the staff had chosen sides without anyone needing to ask them. This wasn't about a painting. This was about remembering who Queen Elizabeth had been, what she had believed, and whether those beliefs would survive her. He heard footsteps behind him. Margaret, the housekeeper, had entered the gallery. She stood beside him, looking up at the portrait with tears streaming down her face. She knew, Margaret whispered. The Queen knew this would happen, knew there would be people who wanted to erase the uncomfortable parts of her legacy, the parts that asked difficult questions. So she made sure there was something they couldn't ignore. Ow! Something permanent. Will Lady Catherine be dismissed? James asked quietly. Margaret wiped her eyes. Probably, but she doesn't care. At futa, none of us who were here, who knew the Queen, we don't care anymore. We're old. We're retiring soon anyway. But this matters. Making sure people remember matters. She reached out and touched the frame gently, as if blessing it. The Queen told me once, near the end, that she worried the monarchy would forget what it was supposed to be. It would become just ceremony and spectacle. No substance, no sacrifice. She said the only way to prevent that was to leave reminders. Things that couldn't be rewritten or reinterpreted. Truth in plain sight. Margaret looked at James. This portrait is one of those reminders. We're going to make sure it stays right here, no matter what happens. The next morning, James arrived for duty to find the palace in barely controlled chaos. Lady Catherine had been summoned to a private meeting with the king. Camilla had made her case. The portrait, she argued, was divisive, created tension among staff. It sent the wrong message about unity in the new reign. The king, ever the peacemaker, had suggested a compromise. Move the portrait to a less prominent location. Perhaps the Queen's private sitting room at Windsor. Somewhere meaningful but not public. Lady Catherine had refused. The meeting had ended badly. Lady Catherine was given 24 hours to reconsider her position. If she continued to refuse, she would be asked to resign. But something unexpected happened next. One by one, Senior, members of the palace staff began to make quiet declarations. The master of the household, the keeper of the privy purse, 3 of the longest-serving ladies-in-waiting, even the Queen's former private secretary who had retired, but returned specifically to make a statement. They all said the same thing. If Lady Catherine was forced out for honoring Queen Elizabeth's wishes, they would resign as well. It wasn't a coordinated effort. It wasn't a rebellion. It was simply a line in the sand. These were people who had devoted their entire lives to the crown, and they were willing to walk away rather than watch the late Queen's memory be diminished. The palace had seen nothing like it in living memory. James heard about it from Thomas, who heard it from one of the household staff, who heard it directly from someone in the meeting. The news spread like wildfire. By noon, even the guards knew. By evening, the story had reached certain members of the press, though none dared print it yet. This was no longer a private matter. This was a crisis. And at the center of it all was a portrait. 2 queens. One message. And a question that nobody wanted to answer out loud. What happens when honoring the past threatens the present? James stood outside the gallery again that night during the late shift. The portrait hung exactly where it had been, unchanged, unmoved. But around it, the palace churned with uncertainty. Inside the frame, Queen Elizabeth's painted eyes seemed to look directly at him, steady, unafraid, certain of her purpose even in death. And James realized something that made his chest tighten. The late Queen had known exactly what she was doing. She had known this would cause conflict, had known it would force people to choose, but she'd done it anyway, because some truths were more important than peace. The question now was whether anyone would have the courage to stand with her. The king called an emergency meeting of the senior household staff at 7 the next morning. James wasn't present, but he heard about it within the hour. Everyone did. The palace couldn't contain secrets anymore. Too many people cared too much. The meeting had been tense. The king, visibly exhausted, had tried once more to find compromise. He suggested a rotating display. The portrait would remain in the gallery for 6 months of the year, then move to Windsor for the other 6. Everyone would be satisfied. But Lady Catherine had stood firm. She'd produced a document signed by Queen Elizabeth herself, outlining exactly where the portrait was to be placed and stating explicitly that it should remain there permanently. The Queen's handwriting. The Queen's seal. Undeniable, Camilla had left the meeting without speaking, and that's when the palace staff began to act. It started small. A gardener who had served the late Queen for 30 years placed a single white rose beneath the portrait. Then a footman added another. By midday, there were a dozen flowers arranged carefully at the base of the frame. By evening, there were 50. No one had organized it. No one had sent a memo. But the message was unmistakable. The staff were voting with flowers. They were choosing Queen Elizabeth's legacy over palace politics. James watched it happen from his post. He saw elderly housekeepers, some barely able to walk, make the journey to the gallery to leave their tributes. He saw junior staff, young men and women who had only served under Queen Elizabeth for a few years, add their flowers to the growing memorial. And he saw something else. He saw tourists and visitors who had been allowed into the palace for scheduled tours pause when they entered the gallery, saw them read the inscription, saw them understand, without anyone needing to explain, that something significant was happening. The flowers kept coming. By the 3rd day, the gallery looked like a shrine. Hundreds of flowers surrounded the portrait. The fragrance of roses and lilies filled the air. Still more arrived. Some staff brought handwritten notes, tucking them among the stems. Messages to the late Queen. Promises to remember. Vows to honor her wishes. Camilla did not visit the gallery. But everyone knew she was aware of what was happening. The king had reportedly asked her to let the matter rest, at least until the flowers were cleared and emotions had cooled. But Camilla's silence felt heavy, waiting. Then something shifted. Princess Anne arrived at the palace unannounced. She had been traveling, attending engagements in Scotland, but she cut her trip short and returned to London. She went directly to the gallery. James was on duty when she arrived. He'd only seen the Princess Royal from a distance before, but up close, he understood why so many people respected her. She moved with purpose. No wasted motion, no performance, just quiet, absolute determination. She stood in front of the portrait for a long time, reading the inscription, examining the details. Then she turned to Lady Catherine, who had been standing nearby, watching over the flowers like a guardian. "My mother would have appreciated this," Anne said simply. Her voice carried in the quiet gallery. Not the flowers, the fight. She would have been glad people cared enough to fight. Lady Catherine's composure finally cracked. Tears ran down her face. "I'm sorry, Your Royal Highness. I know this has caused difficulty." Anne shook her head. "Don't apologize for honoring her wishes. That's exactly what she would have wanted you to do."
Oh.
She paused, looking back at the portrait. "This stays. I'll speak to my brother." It wasn't a request. It was a statement of fact. Anne left the gallery and went directly to see the king. James didn't know what was said in that private conversation, but he could imagine. Anne had always been the most like their mother, practical, duty-focused, unwilling to compromise on matters of principle. When she emerged an hour later, her face was unreadable. She walked past James without acknowledging him, but there was a set to her shoulders that suggested the conversation had not been easy. That evening, an official statement was released to the palace staff. The portrait would remain in the East Gallery permanently, as per Queen Elizabeth's written instructions. The flowers would be respectfully cleared, but a small plaque would be installed beside the frame, explaining the significance of the work and the late Queen's intentions in commissioning it. It was a victory, but it felt hollow. Everyone knew the real battle hadn't been won by logic or protocol. It had been won by sheer force of will and by the collective refusal of people who would love the queen to let her be forgotten. Camilla's response came 2 days later, subtle but unmistakable. She announced plans to commission her own series of portraits, celebrating Queen's consort throughout history. Women who had supported their husbands, women who had found their place beside, not upon the throne. The message was clear. If Elizabeth's legacy was going to be preserved in paint, Camilla would create her own narrative alongside it. The palace staff said nothing publicly, but privately, in the quiet corners where they gathered, James heard them talking. They weren't angry, they were just sad. Sad that it had come to this. Sad that remembering one queen somehow felt like it required diminishing another. But when James walked through the gallery late that night, after most of the flowers had been cleared away, he stopped in front of the portrait one more time. Queen Elizabeth and Queen Victoria stared back at him, frozen in paint but somehow more alive than ever. And beneath them, that inscription gleamed. Service is not a title. It is a calling. Some truths, James thought, were worth fighting for. Even when the fight was painful, even when it divided people who should have been united. Because if you didn't fight for truth, eventually it disappeared. All you'd have left would be carefully crafted stories that made everyone comfortable but meant nothing at all. The portrait remained, and so did the question it asked. What kind of monarchy did Britain want? One built on tradition and sacrifice, or one built on spectacle and personality? The answer, James suspected, would take years to reveal itself. But at least the question was still being asked. Asterisk, asterisk. 3 weeks passed, and the palace settled into an uneasy calm. The portrait remained in the East Gallery. Visitors still stopped to read the inscription. Staff still walked past it with quiet reverence. But the crisis had passed, or at least gone underground. Lady Catherine kept her position, though everyone knew it was only because Princess Anne had intervened. The king had wanted peace. Anne had wanted principle. In the end, blood won over diplomacy. But the cost was visible in the way the household operated now. There was a division, subtle but real, between those who had sided with the late queen's wishes and those who believed Camilla had been unfairly treated. Conversations were careful. Alliances shifted. Trust became a currency in short supply. James noticed it most during shift changes. Guards who used to chat freely now kept their conversations neutral. Staff who had worked together for years suddenly found reasons to avoid each other. The palace had always run on discretion, but now it ran on silence. Then Margaret found the letters. She came to James late one evening, her face pale, carrying a small wooden box wrapped in faded ribbon. He was off duty, sitting in the staff break room, trying to read, but mostly just thinking about everything that had happened. "I need you to see something," Margaret said, her voice shaking slightly. "I found these in the Queen's former study. They were sorting through her private papers, boxing things up for the archives. This was tucked in the back of a drawer." She set the box on the table between them. Inside were 3 letters, written in Queen Elizabeth's distinctive handwriting. Each was dated from the final 6 months of her life, and each was addressed to different people who would serve after her death. One to the king, one to Camilla, and one to the senior household staff. The letter to Camilla was still sealed. Margaret's hands trembled as she touched it. Or if she wanted them found after the portrait was revealed. But I think people need to read them. I think they need to know what she actually intended. "Have you opened any of them?" James asked. "Just the one meant for staff. It's addressed to all of us." She pulled out a single sheet of paper, aged and creased from being folded. "Listen to this." She read aloud, her voice breaking. "To those who have served alongside me, I leave this final thought. The portrait of Queen Victoria and myself is not meant as judgment of anyone. It is not meant to create division or pain. It is simply meant to remind future generations that this institution exists beyond any one person, beyond any one lifetime. We are all temporary custodians of something much larger than ourselves. I painted myself into history beside Victoria, not out of pride, but out of humility, to show that we are all connected, all part of an unbroken chain of service. I hope those who come after me will add their own tributes to this chain, their own reminders, their own truths. The crown is not diminished by honest reflection. It is strengthened by it. Margaret set the letter down. Tears streamed down her face. She wasn't trying to hurt anyone. She was trying to preserve something. The idea that this is bigger than personalities. It's bigger than any individual reign. James felt something crack open in his chest. For weeks, he'd been watching people fight over what the Queen had meant, what she'd intended. And now here was her actual voice, clear and unmistakable. "What about the other letters?" he asked. Margaret looked at the sealed envelopes. "I don't know. Part of me wants to deliver them. Let people read her actual words instead of guessing. But part of me wonders if opening them will just make things worse." They sat in silence for a long moment. Finally, James spoke. "I think you have to deliver them. It's not because it will fix anything, but because people deserve to know the truth. Even if the truth is complicated." Margaret nodded slowly. She carefully placed the letters back in the box. "I'll give them to Lady Catherine. She'll know what to do." But before Margaret could stand, the break room door opened. Camilla's private secretary entered, her face carefully neutral. Behind her, 2 senior palace officials. They'd clearly been looking for Margaret. "Ms. Ashford would like to speak with you," the secretary said quietly. "Both of you now." James and Margaret exchanged a glance. Someone had reported the letters. Someone had been watching. In a palace full of secrets, nothing stayed hidden for long. They followed the officials through dim corridors to a small private office. Lady Catherine was already there, standing by the window. When she saw the box in Margaret's hands, her expression shifted. Recognition, then something like relief. "You found them," Lady Catherine said softly. "You knew?" Margaret asked. "The Queen told me they existed. She never told me where she'd hidden them. I've been searching for months." Lady Catherine stepped forward. "Hey." Margaret handed over the box. Lady Catherine opened it, touching each letter gently, as if they were sacred artifacts. But when she reached the one addressed to Camilla, she paused. "This changes everything." "We deliver it?" Margaret asked. Lady Catherine looked up, her eyes sharp and clear. "That depends. Do you believe people can change their minds when presented with truth? Or do you believe they'll simply reject truth that doesn't fit their narrative?" It was a question without an easy answer. James found himself thinking about the past 3 weeks. About the anger and division, about people choosing sides based on incomplete information and hurt feelings, about how much easier it was to believe the worst of others than to seek understanding. "I think," he said slowly, "that the Queen wouldn't have written these letters if she didn't believe truth mattered. Even difficult truth." Lady Catherine smiled, sad and knowing. "Then we deliver them. All of them. We let the truth do what truth does best." "What's that?" Margaret asked. "Reveal who people really are?" The next morning, the letters were delivered. James didn't see what happened when Camilla read hers, but he heard about it later from Thomas, who heard it from someone who worked in the private chambers. Camilla had read the letter alone. When she emerged, her face was red from crying. She'd asked for privacy for the rest of the day. No statements, no appearances, just silence. And in that silence, something shifted. Something none of them could quite name yet, but could feel all the same. The contents of Queen Elizabeth's letter to Camilla were never made public. Whatever words the late Queen had written remained private, sealed between 2 women separated by death but connected by the weight of the crown. But the effects of that letter rippled through the palace like stones dropped in still water, too. Days after receiving it, Camilla requested a private viewing of the portrait. Not with staff, not with advisors, just herself, alone in the gallery, standing before the image of 2 queens and the words that had caused so much pain. James was on duty that morning. He stood outside the gallery doors, while Camilla spent nearly an hour inside. When she finally emerged, her face was composed. But her eyes were different, softer, thoughtful. She paused beside James, something she had never done before. For a moment, he thought she might speak of acknowledgement before continuing down the corridor. That afternoon, Camilla made a quiet announcement. She would be commissioning a new portrait to hang in the West Gallery. directly across the palace from Queen Victoria's tribute. But this portrait wouldn't be of herself, it would be a companion. Peace, showing Queen Alexandra and Queen Mary, two queens consort who had served before her, standing together in service. And beneath their image would be a new inscription, chosen by Camilla herself. Service takes many forms. All are necessary. All are valued. When Lady Catherine heard about it, she wept. Not from sadness this time, but from something that looked remarkably like hope. The two portraits, east and west, became symbolic of something larger. They didn't erase the division that had opened in the palace. They didn't make everyone agree. But they created space for different truths to exist simultaneously. For tradition and evolution to share the same halls. James walked between them often during his patrols. The portrait of Victoria and Elizabeth reminding visitors that the crown was built on sacrifice and duty. And the portrait of Alexandra and Mary, reminding them that partnership and support mattered too. Neither was more important than the other. Both were true. Margaret retired 3 months later, as she'd always planned. On her last day, she stood before Queen Elizabeth's portrait one final time. James was there too, saying goodbye to the woman who'd helped him understand what had really been at stake. "Do you think it was worth it?" James asked. "All the fighting. All the pain." Margaret smiled. "The Queen once told me that the hardest part of leadership is knowing when to fight and when to let go. She fought for this because she believed some things shouldn't be forgotten. But she also wrote those letters because she knew healing was possible. Even after conflict, maybe especially after conflict." She touched the frame gently, the way she always did. "Worth it? I don't know. But necessary? Absolutely." James thought about that long after Margaret left. About necessity and cost. About the price of truth and the value of memory. The palace moved on, as palaces always do. New staff arrived. New routines developed. The flowers around the portrait were eventually removed, replaced by velvet ropes and small explanatory plaques. Tourists took photographs. Guides explained the significance. Life continued. But every so often, James would see someone stop in front of the portrait longer than others. Would see them read the inscription carefully, then look up at Queen Elizabeth's painted face with recognition in their eyes. They understood. Maybe not all of it. Maybe not the whole story of what had happened in those tense weeks. But they understood that this was more than just a painting. It was a question, a challenge, a reminder. Service is not a title. It is a calling. And that question remained alive in the halls of the palace. Asked silently by two queens who had served in different centuries, but believed in the same fundamental truth. That duty mattered more than comfort. That legacy was earned, not given. And that the only way to honor those who came before was to serve with the same integrity they had shown, regardless of whether anyone was watching. James served at Buckingham Palace for 7 more years. He saw kings and queens come and go through the halls, saw celebrations and sorrows, saw the monarchy evolve in ways Queen Elizabeth probably never imagined. But the portrait remained exactly where she'd placed it, unchanged, unmoved, a permanent reminder in a world of temporary things. And sometimes, late at night, when the palace was quiet and the tourists had gone home, James would stand in front of it during his rounds. Would look at those two painted faces, stern and gentle, powerful and humble. And he would remember the weeks when the palace had chosen sides. When flowers had filled the gallery. When truth had been more important than peace. He would remember Margaret and Lady Catherine and all the others who had been willing to lose everything to honor a promise. And he would think about Queen Elizabeth's final gift. Not the portrait itself, but what it had revealed. That there were still people willing to fight for what mattered. Still people who believed service was sacred. Still people who understood that remembering the past wasn't about living in it, but about carrying its best parts forward into an uncertain future. The quiet fury Camilla had shown that day in the gallery had been real. The pain of feeling judged, of wondering if she would ever measure up, had been genuine. But so had her growth, her willingness to read the late Queen's words and let them change her. In the end, both women had been right, and both had been wrong. And maybe that was the real lesson. that the crown was big enough for different truths, strong enough to hold complexity, old enough to survive honest disagreement. James finished his shift that night and walked out of the palace into the cool London air. Behind him, the building glowed with warm light, ancient and enduring. Inside those walls, two portraits hung in separate galleries, telling different stories about service and duty and the price of history. In between them, invisible but unbreakable, was the thread that connected them. The understanding that some fights are worth having, some truths are worth preserving, and some promises, even after death, are worth keeping. Queen Elizabeth had known that, had counted on it, had bet her legacy on the belief that people would remember what mattered. And standing in front of her portrait, surrounded by the silent testimony of those who had fought to keep it there, James believed she had been right. The crown would endure. Not because it was perfect, but because people still cared enough to fight for what it represented: service, duty, truth, not as titles, but as callings. And that, more than any portrait or inscription, was the legacy that would outlast them all.